Welcome, guys. We're here. We're back. This is so cool. Thank you all for coming. I know if we've hit over 7,000 people, and I think we're closing in on 8,000, which was like numbers from Tampa. So like we really are back, and thank you guys for coming again. This is really exciting. My name's Jeff Kleiman. I'm on the AWP board, so if you see anybody with these yellow lanyards, you should accost us if you have any questions or concerns, because we really want to make this a great event for everybody. I think we're all just so thrilled that we're coming back, huh? Okay, so who am I? I am wearing a gray blazer and a blue shirt and a yellow lanyard, and I'm a middle-aged guy with brown hair, and I think that does it for me. Okay. Also want to take the opportunity to give you a friendly reminder that AWP is still requiring all participants to wear masks in public spaces like this event, and I will put my mask on, I swear to God, Colleen, as soon as this is over. Okay, so we're pleased to bring the event today. Before we introduce the featured speakers, I want to acknowledge our premier conference sponsor, Wilkes University Creative Writing. Our literary partners and sponsors allow AWP to present these extraordinary literary events and help us keep our conference affordable and accessible. Please join me in thanking all the conference sponsors and partners for their support and participation. So, a few housekeeping details that you all should know about. Please silence your cell phones. So one more time, everybody turn off your cell phones. So when I'm not doing this, I'm actually a volunteer usher in Manhattan and Broadway. And so I'm the person that holds up the sign saying silence your cell phones. So silence your cell phones. Okay, remember there's no flash photography. We respect any seats that are marked for accessibility needs. So there's going to be a book signing directly outside afterward. So when the authors are finished speaking today, please allow them to get to speak. And what I'm going to try to do is have the authors sitting sort of closer together, and then have the lines go out in opposite directions, and I'll be helping facilitate and have you guys put names on pieces of paper so they can personalize the books. So your help in making that happen would be helpful. Okay, what else? Please be aware, your fellow attendees who may have disabilities, and help AWP be more accessible. Specifically, if you see a barrier to accessibility, let us know by calling or texting our accessibility hotline at, you ready for writing this number down? Please carve it into your arms, 215-770-7291. That is 215-770-7291. Operators are standing by. Please also be aware that some people have invisible disabilities and do not question someone's use of an accommodation. Okay, that's done with that. Thank you, and now it's my great pleasure and honor to welcome Melanie McNair, the Senior Director of Programming at the Center for Fiction, which is an extraordinary organization, who will introduce our presenters. So thank you all, congratulations, and here we go.
Hello, everyone. I am so happy to be at AWP. It's been, 6 or 7 years since I was at one, and the world has changed a lot since then. And I tell you, after hosting maybe 200 Zoom events, it's a real pleasure to actually see human faces, even if it's from the nose up. So, and if I know you and I don't recognize you, it's because I can't see your face. So if you aren't familiar with us, the Center for Fiction is the only literary nonprofit that focuses on the creation and enjoyment of fiction. We're located in Brooklyn, New York. We've got an amazing space there with an auditorium, a members lounge, cafe, a bookstore. It's really an oasis for readers. And we do writing workshops, reading groups, which is kind of a cross between a seminar and a book club. And we do lots of events. We also have an emerging writers program. And if you live in New York City and you haven't published your first novel yet, please come by our booth. It's 1024 in the book fair and learn more about the program and apply. The reason I chose Brandon and Melissa to talk together is we've heard a lot of people talking about the problems with diversity in publishing. And I believe the problems with diversity start way before it gets to publication. And Melissa's written an amazing book about some of the problems that come up in writing workshops and things, and some new ways of thinking about this. Her book, Bodywork, is amazing. I hope you all buy it if you haven't yet. And of course, Brandon Taylor has also been very outspoken about this in essays, and his books are brilliant. So we're really happy to have them both. Just going to read their bios for you. Melissa is the author of the critically acclaimed memoir Whip Smart and the essay collection Abandon Me, which was a Lambda Literary Award finalist, a Publishing Triangle Award finalist, an Indie Next Pick, and was widely named a Best Book of 2017. Her second essay collection, Girlhood, a national bestseller, was published by Bloomsbury on March 30th. Last year. Girlhood won the National Book Critics Circle Award in Criticism and was named a notable book of 2021 by NPR, Time, The Washington Post, and others. And then, of course, Bodywork, just came out. She's joined in conversation by Brandon Taylor, the author of the novel Real Life, which was a New York Times Editor's Choice and shortlisted for the 2020 Booker Prize, as well as the National Book Critics Circle John Leonard Prize and the 2021 Young Lions Fiction Award. His work has appeared in Guernica, American Short Fiction, Gulf Coast, BuzzFeed Reader, the Oprah Magazine, Gay Mag, The New Yorker Online, The Literary Review, and elsewhere. His second book, Filthy Animals, is a collection of short fiction. He holds graduate degrees from the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Iowa Writers Workshop, where he was an Iowa Arts Fellow. Welcome them up, and we will have an audience Q&A too.
Thank you, Melanie. I'm gonna give you a real hug. Whew,
We're here.
here we are.
Oh, wow. Oh, wow.
Very bright.
This feels fake somehow.
I mean, is it the bottle opener?
Maybe. Oh, wow. We're in the big time,
Here,
Melissa.
we have these fancy glasses.
Ooh, so satisfying.
I'm gonna open yours.
Oh, please, thank you. And I'll
Yeah,
talk
yeah.
about how much I love your work while you. So thrilled to be here with all of you. So thrilled to be here with Melissa, whose new book is so. I spent a lot of time with it on the train reading, and I feel so sorry for the people who were sitting next to me on the train, because every other page I would be like, no, she didn't. Or like, oh my, I simply cannot believe she's going there. It's such a thrilling and electrifying examination of the myths we have about this thing we call craft in writing, which I think has for so long been like this, held up as to be this sort of objective, cold, austere, capital T truth. And in fact, what you reveal in this book is that craft is really just kind of a set of ideas.
That's right. Thank you so much. Oh my God. Yeah, I don't think I could say anything better about my book than what you just said. So instead I will talk about Filthy Animals, which was, similarly, I read it in a big gulp. And I'm embarrassed to admit this, but I hadn't read a story collection in a while. I have this like weird aversion to story collections, even though I enjoy reading them whenever I do. And I was reminded of exactly why, because your stories sort of grab one by the neck, pull them into an excruciating and expertly designed moment of tension and desire and resentment and awkwardness and anxiety, and then sort of holds you there, spits you back out, and I was like gasping after each story and then got yanked right into the next one. It was, I can't say that it was entirely pleasurable, but I was very impressed by the end of it, and a bit ravaged, like all of these characters that you torture.
Well, you know, I can't say it was entirely pleasurable for me to write, though.
I mean, is it ever entirely pleasurable?
Well, as you would know, if you all pick up Bodywork, you'll find no, it is never quite entirely pleasurable, but neither is it miserable.
That's right. It's a little bit of an S&M experience being a writer, as you all know. Right. You have to be into punishment a little bit.
Amazing. Will you start us off with a reading?
I will.
Oh, I'm so excited.
Oh my God. Okay, I'm just going to read a little bit from the first essay. And I will say particularly about this essay that unlike my other essays, which usually arise out of some like freaked out, obsessive, circling something inside my head, this essay really arose out of conversations I had with students that were mirroring my own experience, but I just found myself, and I know there's a lot of teachers here, repeating myself over and over and over again and telling these illustrative anecdotes about my own experience with this sort of internalized bias against personal writing. And I got so tired of repeating myself, I was like, I'm just gonna put it all down so that I can stop saying it. And of course that didn't work at all. I'm gonna say it again right now. In praise of navel gazing. In a recent nonfiction workshop I taught, a female student cringed when I suggested she include more of her own story in an essay. The narrative experimented with form and suggested a history of sexual trauma, but quickly shifted into more lyrical and analytical musing on the general subject. She frowned. But I don't want to seem self-absorbed, navel gazing. The rest of the room, nearly all women, this was at Sarah Lawrence, by the way, nodded. There's a scene that has played out everywhere I have taught writing, at colleges of all sizes, conferences, and private salons. It is a concern I have heard from countless students and peers, and which I have often greeted with a combination of bafflement and frustration. Since when did telling our own stories and deriving their insights become so reviled? It doesn't matter if the story is your own, I tell them over and over, only that you tell it well. Should we not always tell stories so that their specificity reveals some larger truth? And yet, how many times have I been privy to conversations among writers in which we sneer at the very concept? We compulsively assure each other that writing isn't about enacting a kind of therapy. How gross. We are intellectuals. We are artists. I mean, you can't expect people to be interested in your diary, a friend and fellow teacher exclaimed once. I nodded. What kind of monstrous narcissist would make that mistake? And I'm just gonna skip all the way to the end, but just know that there's about 20 pages of me rebutting this idea in really wonderful, persuasive ways. I cite scientific studies that prove that personal writing is therapeutic. So I'm just gonna skip to the pep talk at the end. I don't mean to argue that writing personally is for everyone. What I'm saying is, don't avoid yourself. The story that comes calling might be your own, and it might not go away if you don't open the door. I don't believe in writer's block. I only believe in fear. And you can be afraid and still write something. No one has to read it, though when you're done, you might want them to. One of the epigraphs of my second book, though it could be an epigraph for my life, is a quote from the British psychoanalyst D.W. Winnicott. It is joy to be hidden and disaster not to be found. If that made you feel like you're gonna pee your pants, then you're not alone. That was my first response to that quote. Almost everything I've ever written started with a secret, with the fear that my subject was unspeakable. Without exception, writing about these subjects has not only freed me from fear, but from the subjects themselves, and from the bondage of believing I might be alone in them. What I have also observed is that avoiding a secret subject can be its own kind of bondage. To William H. Gass's argument, quote, to have written an autobiography is already to have made yourself a monster, I say that refusing to write your story can make you into a monster. Or perhaps more accurately, we are already monsters. And to deny the monstrous is to deny its beauty, its meaning, its necessary devastation. Transforming my secrets into art has transformed me. I believe that stories like these have the power to transform the world. That is the point of literature, or at least that's what I tell my students. We are writing the history that we could not find in any book. We are telling the stories that no one else can tell, and we are giving this proof of our survival to each other. And I'll stop there. If I could only just hear that sound that you made after every reading, it would be enough. No more applause, just Brandon gasping and sighing.
So each of the essays in this book, each of the sections, it starts with it starts with like a received idea about personal writing and the sort of assumption, the sort of cultural assumptions we have about it. And then you sort of meticulously go through and unpick not only the received idea, but the cultural impulses behind the received idea. And then right when I'm feeling like, oh my gosh, my brain is on fire, I don't know if I can, like, what is the point of going on? You always sort of, at the end of each of the chapters, you sort of do this great uplift, and I feel really activated and called to action. And I don't know how you do it. It's wizardry, or maybe it's just the inverted pyramid of persuasive writing, but it's, I mean, it's a brilliant book for all those reasons. I just love it. I guess my first question is like, where do you think those received ideas about personal writing, the sort of stigma on personal writing, where do you think those come from?
I mean, where don't they come from, honestly? You know, I mean, I think that process that you described, you were describing sort of the structure of the essays, but it's also the structure of my own thought, right? That is the progression of me sort of picking at a thread of my own resistance or my own, you know, all of these essays really started ultimately with me discerning that an idea that was prevailing in my own mind was not my own. And I was like, okay, when I started writing a memoir, it was I was writing very serious fiction, or so I thought. And I started writing memoir based on an assignment from a teacher, and it was the most terrifying, empowering, urgent experience of writing I'd ever had in my life, short of like early childhood stuff. And my first thought was, I absolutely can't write a memoir. Oh no, I couldn't do that. I need to be serious. I need people to respect me. I need men to respect me, and I cannot write about spanking them and be respected. And then I had this sort of second thought, which was like, wait a minute, and I'm compressing like years here, or at least months. Like, why do I think that? Because stories, embodied stories of particularly queer women, but folks of all historically marginalized ideas, the embodied, intellectual, brainy, weird, honest, awkward, true stories. And by true, I mean in a way that transcends genre. Those are my stories. Those are the stories that made me want to write, that ended me up in graduate school where I was at that moment. So where did this idea come from, right? And I sort of traced it back, and I talked to my students, and it's actually pretty simple, right? It's like, if we are upholding this ideal of this kind of cold, disembodied intellectualism, it's just white supremacy. It's just patriarchy, that's it. It's like such an obvious and disappointing answer, but the power structures and hierarchies that are reflected in our internalized biases towards the craft of writing are exactly that which govern our society, right? And so it's always a good question, right? Like, I read a lot of mysteries, and the question is always like, who benefits from this? Where's the money? Where's the power? Who benefits from this murder or this silencing, right? And when I think about it that way, like, who benefits from my silence or from your silence? It's a pretty easy answer. It's the same answer it's always been.
Yeah. Related to that, I found it really fascinating when you were talking about trauma and the writing of trauma. There have been many essays in the culture as of late around this idea of the trauma narrative, or fiction or narrative storytelling that is sort of oriented around trauma as a totalizing explication for all the woes in one's life. And how that can be flattening in terms of storytelling, and perhaps we should aspire to higher aesthetic purposes. And something that I've always felt, that's a sort of line of thinking that when I was a younger writer, I absolutely agreed with, because I thought, well, why would I write about my trauma? That's so easy. I want to write real fiction about people I made up and nothing that happened to me personally, because that's the real stuff.
Exactly.
And as I've gotten older, I've been like, well, actually, no, that's just terror of writing about things that happened to you. But the sort of recent sort of cachet of essays and writing on trauma and how we should be steering away from it got me thinking about this moment in the book where you're talking about, like, well, who benefits from traumatized people not writing about their trauma? Isn't that funny how isn't it funny how the people who are telling you not to write about your trauma because it's not real stuff are often the people who did the traumatizing?
Yeah, exactly. It's actually so, I mean, the mechanisms of oppression they're not sophisticated, right? It's very crude sort of movement, but it has the momentum of centuries behind it, so it doesn't need to be sophisticated, right? And because we're disciplining ourselves, right? It's been so conditioned into us that we're doing it to each other, right? Like, ew, navel gazing, ew, the trauma plot. I mean, I do understand the way that a trope can become tiresome, right? But I think about trauma, like, we talk about trauma as if it's this one thing, and I think about it almost the way that I think about diagnosis, right? Like, diagnosis in the DSM whatever number we're on, it's just collections of symptoms, right? There are an infinite number of stories and experiences within those. So I don't even understand how a trauma plot insofar as it exists, right? Because what we're talking about are human beings and their stories and the ways that we have named them through psychology or the emotional landscape but you can call it whatever you want.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, and I feel like this comes back to craft in that there's something about the distillation of one's experience to art, in this case, like stories. There's something that happens when you sort of reduce and distill that sort of complicated human experience with art to like talking about plot and character. When ultimately, like what stays with us after we engage a story or art is ultimately, I feel like something that's much more difficult to sort of pin down. That sort of almost, that ineffable human quality to the story and to art. And I feel like something very similar is happening with trauma in that like we sort of reduce trauma to this sort of cachet of like tropes and ideas about trauma, like the abusive childhood or like the horrible parents or the bad partner. And nobody who's experienced those things is thinking like, wow, I'm glad that singular event of my life is over. Like it's a sort of ongoing, incredibly complicated human experience. And to try to capture that in art is so difficult.
It's true. And I think we're always, human beings, when we're talking about things, we're always trying to sort of silo or categorize or diagnose. We're just trying to find a way to talk about the ineffable and the infinite, right? And when we're making art, we're not thinking, I'm writing a plot and it's about trauma, right? We're drawing from like the deep bedrock of our creative intelligence to try to articulate something that cannot be articulated in a literal way, right? And so to call it, it just is sort of putting the name for things in the place of the thing that we're making, right? We make art because we can't talk about these things in this simplistic kind of way.
Oh, yeah.
Okay. Will you read from Filthy Animals?
Oh,
something?
sure.
All right, and maybe can you read something that you think speaks to sort of what we've been talking about? Right? Like a way that you are diving into the experience of a character. And if you wanted to zoom out like many miles from it, maybe we would say it's about trauma, but really you are just articulating the infinite matrix of sensory experience that a person is having in a particular moment with another person.
Yeah, sure. I think maybe I'll read from As Though That Were Love, which is a story about two men who were friends in Iowa City, and their friendship is complicated because one of them wants to have sex and one of them is like, we tried that, it didn't work.
Oh God, this is the one when I was talking about being pulled into a kind of rapture and held in a moment that I desperately wanted to flee but could not avert my eyes from. This is the story I was thinking of.
Yeah, oh, well, there's so much grabbing by the throat in this story.
There is a lot of grabbing.
There was a lot of that, yeah. Okay, so I'm going to read a section where the main character, Harchis, is thinking about his own childhood and he had these dogs. And it's about love and trying to figure out what love is. More distantly, Harchis could hear whining, baying, and felt a flurry of homesickness. When he had lived with his grandparents during the murky middle years of his childhood, he had raised 3 dogs into brilliant hunters, gristle, bone, and marrow. He had run his hand along their spines, teaching them to be still, to be quiet, to wait. He'd felt their hearts beating, slowing, growing inured to the length of time it took for the world to show its belly. They had been mutts when he found them, 3 butterscotch pups clinging to life, drenched in ants and beetles. But he'd rinsed them clean and loved on them the way nobody had loved on him. He had taught them to hunt, to be keen and swift as they stalked and waited. He'd taught them to fetch it first with dolls and dummies filled with clay and rocks, realistic weights, and later they'd brought him the real thing, ducks wet and warm with blood, pheasant, squirrel. Whatever Harchis trained his rifle on, they penned and cornered and stalled. They could tree anything, the 3 of them, even turkeys, frothing with rage, bodies humming, ready to take flight. But the dogs calling in the distance were not his dogs. The dogs baying in the distance slept inside and ran from their shadows. Gristle, bone, and marrow would have eaten those dogs alive because Harchis had loved them enough to teach them how to fight, how to maim, how to kill. And the people here, in this place, let their dogs sleep in their beds as though that were love.
Beautiful.
Oh, thank you.
Oh, God, can't you smell it? That's how I know. Right?
Oh, well.
Well, can you talk to me a little bit about these stories? So I know you published a novel a couple years ago?
Yeah, I know.
What is time? Just a piece of paper folding and folding and folding. So were these stories written over the course of time that just talk to me about it.
Yeah, so the stories, I mean, and it's so funny that we're here talking about trauma. So the collection, you know, it's got a curious structure. So it's got 5 or 6 linked stories, and then in between Lionel, and then in between each episode, there are what I call these interstitial stories. And the linked stories are about this depressed Black math major in Madison, Wisconsin, and he goes to a potluck where he meets these 2 dancers, and they become a sort of folie à trois, I guess. They sort of become enmeshed in an open relationship and triangulate desire. And I wrote those stories. I wrote Lionel because at the time I was going through a really difficult period in my own life. I was living in the Midwest. I was away from home and everything I'd ever known. I was in grad school. I was really depressed. I was really anxious. I was in one of the most, suicidal fugues I'd ever been in, and I felt so lonely. I felt so incredibly lonely, and I felt that I couldn't even tell people about it because I would try to express some of what I felt, and people would, they'd give you platitudes. Oh, you'll get better. You'll bounce back. Have you tried exercise?
Acupuncture. People love to be like, have you ever tried acupuncture?
I have a warm tea for you. My thesis advisor recommended that I find like a Black church in town and go to that. Like it was, and I just felt so lonely, and I thought, well, I feel very, very alone, but if I can create this character who feels the things that I feel, then I can feel a little less alone in the world. And so I started writing stories about this guy who was a lot like me but wasn't me, and just sort of following him through his life. And the fiction became a way of, it wasn't like a full catharsis, I wouldn't say that, but I did feel so much less lonely because whenever I had a really difficult day, I could just go to the page and write about a person who was having a similar thing. And I think so much of what your book explores is this idea of the ways that sometimes we aren't silenced necessarily, but when we try to make ourselves known to other people are not available to us. And that is a kind of bondage, that is a kind of silence. And it sort of almost doubles the trauma in some way, this feeling of not being able to sort of make yourself known to others, and the power of turning to writing as a means of like, getting it out of your brain.
It's interesting, it's like reading these stories you name so accurately, and I would say this above, there are many, many succinctly named experiences in your stories, but this one that Lionel has of being, that scene at the potluck, of being sort of sunk into this reality of anxiety and depression and suicidality, and being around other people, and the ways that it can emphasize the loneliness, and it can be like you're sort of trapped in this little opaque capsule of sorrow, trying to interact across it, trying to have like a corporeal interaction with other people, and the sort of desperate craving and just the excoriating experience of trying to connect and being unable to reach beyond the chasm that you're in inside yourself. And as you were talking about it, it's really interesting because often the way I talk about nonfiction is that in those moments when I can't connect with myself, I can't connect with other people, or I'm afraid of being seen, to write about experience with the constraint of the nonfiction element. Like I have to rely on my memories or my research. It becomes like a kind of puzzle, and I can confront or face or interact with myself in a way that I can't bear, even in therapy, right? Or even in a journal, because I have this mediator of craft, right? It's like I am the aesthetic artist part of my brain turns on, and she is kind of a sociopath. She's a surgeon, you know what I mean? She's not a patient. So like me, the patient gets to use the scalpel for a little while, and it creates this distance between experience where I can breathe, where I can sort of look at her with the coolness of the surgeon instead of with the fear of the patient, right? I don't know if I want to go any further with that analogy, but it's interesting because with fiction, because I also write fiction rarely, but I feel so stymied by choice. I'm a Libra. There's like Libra all over my chart, right? So I'm like, I need that constraint of nonfiction, but as you were describing writing experience through the story, I could sort of hear how it's a very similar experience where you're sort of creating a diorama or a model of experience, and being the director of the play gives you a little bit of distance to look at it. Does that make sense?
No, I mean, I totally agree with that assessment. I mean, for me, I treat fiction, because it was the first way I had of making narrative, but I also feel this way about my essays, but I consider all narrative to be a sort of virtual space into which to sort of hash out questions about life or pain or whatever. And for me, every narrative is an experiment. It's like a little space to sort of run simulations and to ask what if, and to sort of pursue my ideas and my questions about my own motivations and the motivations of others as far as I can pursue them with as much rigor and intelligence and care as I can possibly muster. And so, yeah, I consider narrative absolutely a narrative space, a crucible almost of figuring stuff out. But I mean, I kind of love what you say about like you get to be the surgeon instead of the patient. I feel, I don't know, I feel sometimes that I write and then I'll be writing and I'll be like, oh, I'm having a great time, whatever. And then I'll find myself having these horrible nightmares for weeks on end. Like recently I was working on an adaptation of my novel, and it involved revisiting some really difficult parts of that book, which I hadn't thought about since I'd published it. And I started having really terrible nightmares about home and about my family. And I was like, why am I feeling so weird? And I called my friend who's a clinician, and I was like, I'm having all these weird dreams now. And he's like, well, are you doing anything different? I'm like, no, I'm just kind of like rewriting the most traumatic parts of the novel, but like, I don't know. I'm over that. Like, I've processed it. And he's like, oh, honey, I think you're triggered. I think that you have accidentally like reactivated your trauma. And so sometimes like I used to think that when I wrote about something, I was safe from it, but no.
Isn't it always so shocking to find that you're a human being again? It's like, I wrote a whole book about this, and yet then when I have like a reasonable human response to writing about a traumatic subject, or even just like moving, I'm like, why am I so freaked out? What's going on? Is it that I'm a human being? Like,
yeah.
fuck.
So much of it is that feeling.
Or just like I already talked about this for 10 years in therapy, like case closed, am I right? The case is never closed.
No, it's never.
Is what you learn.
I mean, and also I feel like part of it is because I had this idea that by writing about it, I was mastering it. I was mastering the difficult material that I was using craft, right? To wrangle the sort of difficult, messy humanness of it. And I was like, it is in a pristinely structured short story. I have nothing to fear from the worst parts of my life. That's over. That's so over. I'm writing about new stuff now.
Yeah, it's sort of like, like we go into it. I have to tell myself this fantasy that wearing, you know, the bear suit? There's like the bear suit that you wear so you can go get thrown around by grizzly bears and it protects you. I don't know. Do you all know, about the bear suit? Anyway, it's like I think, oh, my craft is like my bear suit. I'll zip it up and I won't feel a thing, but you're still getting tossed around by a grizzly bear. You're still gonna feel it, right? And I think, one of the things that makes people sort of recoil from the idea of personal writing and the idea of it being therapeutic is this misconception that by me or anyone saying it's cathartic or it's therapeutic, we're suggesting that once you write about it, you will be healed, it will be over, and it's such a simplistic idea, and that's not it, right? It's just that by writing about it, it gives us a forum, as you're saying, a simulation in which to relate to it, so that we can, if not make friends with it, at least find a way to talk to it, to change our relationship to that experience, so that even if we're not moving on forever, we can talk about it, right? Like everything that I couldn't talk about once I wrote about it, whether in nonfiction or fiction, then I had a way to talk about it because I had been through this process that was mediated by the aesthetic process, right?
Yeah, I mean, the way that I think about it is that for me, the process of like writing about difficult things from life, sort of moving the difficulties of life into narrative, it's like ascending a never-ending mountain.
Or like that escalator out there.
Yes, the never-ending, and you never quite reach the top of it, but you do reach plateaus from which your perspective changes.
Yeah.
And all you're ever getting is a slightly better view of the landscape. You're never at the top, you're only ever ascending up the mountain of perspective.
Yeah, it's like therapy or any other human experience, right? Except aging, which is going down the escalator. Where you do all of the work, you find your feelings, you get a new perspective, and I always suffer under the repetitive misconception that the reward for that process should be that I never have to feel anything ever again. But unfortunately, that is not the reward. The reward is that I get access to more feelings. So rude.
How is there that much room in the human body for emotion? I just have no idea. Where do we store it?
There's like a little clown closet in my armpit, and the feelings just keep rushing out of it.
I think, can I ask you one more question before we move to audience cues?
Yeah.
And I asked this because one of my students asked me this in class Tuesday, and it has to do with writing about other people or writing about people in your life. And there's a really excellent section in this book about that. One of my favorite parts of the book, the 6 parables of writing about real people. Could you just talk a little bit about the ethics of writing from life and the kinds of questions that you confront yourself with and that you are also confronted with by people that you've written about?
This is probably, you probably even get questions about this. I think everyone does, even fiction writers. But as a memoirist who's written about, things I previously thought were unspeakable, the most common question that I've gotten over the last 15 years is, what about other people? What about your mom? What about your ex? Like, how do I deal with these people in these relationships? Because, we want to write memoirs about things, not because we're comfortable talking about them, but because we find them unspeakable. It is, and one of the reasons why we find them unspeakable is because other people would be mad at us. And that, to many of us, at least all of us millennials, is a kind of death, a kind of psychic death if someone's mad at you. And I think when I started out writing, as a defensive measure, I sort of adopted the kind of like Annie Lamott perspective. And she has a famous quote, which I'm going to butcher, in Bird by Bird, where she basically says, if people wanted to come off better in your book, they should have acted better. And I was like, that's handy. Or I did the book launch for this with Mary Carr, and I was like, what do you do? How do you handle this sensitive subject? And Mary Carr said, I tell them, write your own book. So you're welcome to start with this, write your own book. But I will say that actual life experience has chastened me, and like everything, it just gets more and more sort of complex. And as it turns out, if I have an active relationship with someone, it's important for me to handle that relationship and that person's feelings with care, And there are boundaries that I didn't have in the beginning that I have drawn as a result of hurting people that I love, and also having to show up for some really, really hard conversations that I would prefer to avoid next time. There is so much to say about the subject. I had to write like a 20-page essay about it, but there is no way to avoid other people being angry at you, but I have found that there is a careful path that that minds my own ethics around it, and that is loving, if not people-pleasing, to those I love. People I don't love can write their own book.
I love that. I love that, being alive to the possibilities.
Wait, okay, last question, and I know we have to go to Q&A, but do you ever get people being like, that's me?
Oh my God. Oh wow, okay. Yes, not often, but yes, and this happened recently. I wrote a story that was in the Yale Review, and I told a friend, I was invited to an election potluck, and I showed up and I looked around and I was like, wow, this is gonna make a really great story. So I turned to the person who invited me and I say, I'm gonna write about this. And he said, great, that's why I invited you. And so I wrote about the story, I wrote about the potluck. I mean, it wasn't really about it, but I sort of took
Right.
the general premise. And like, as a token of like affection for this person, I was like, well, he invited me to this potluck. I'm gonna like, just like take a couple physical details from him and like put it as like an homage, and it'll be like very funny. It'll be so funny. And it was, I got a text from him, and you know, he was upset. And I was like, but it's not you, the character isn't you. He goes, yeah, I know that, and you know that, and everyone who knows me knows that, but people who read this are gonna think it's real. And I was like, but it's a story, it's fiction. He goes, yes, I know it's all made up, but people could think it's real. And, you know, and so I had to sort of take a moment and be like, okay, so this isn't like you think I like made you out to be an evil person. You have concerns, and I'm gonna listen to your concerns. And, you know, I offered to pull the story before it went. I offered to give him, you know, the fee that I got for the story as reparation. And I was just like, look, like, you are my friend. I care about you. I care about our relationship. I wasn't doing anything malicious. I wasn't trying to be malicious, but I understand that you feel hurt and that you feel that this is a moral and ethical injury. And I want to make it right to you. So tell me what you need from me for this to be okay, or for you to feel that this has been addressed. And you know, we talked about it and we hashed it out, and things are fine. But that was an instance where I was like, oh, I thought we were gonna have a giggle about this, and we did not.
I got one of those emails like a week ago. I mean, I will say that it has happened so often that I think I am, that it's an homage, that it's a compliment, that it's a wink at a friend, and it is safe to assume that they will almost always feel that it is an insult. Because you cannot, you know, when we look at people, we see our image of them. You can't measure your representation against their self-conception, right?
Totally.
And the very things that we think would be complimentary are their most vulnerable moments, the most vulnerable details of their self-conception. We just cannot know. So tread carefully.
And also, it's like you just have to be willing to be available to their feeling of hurt over the gap between your intention and their feelings.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, you were more available than I usually am. Like, tell me what I can do is not something I say to very many people.
Iowa City is a small place, as you are.
It's true. It's true. I wasn't sorry to leave for some of those reasons. There is some wreckage from some writing wreckage I wasn't sorry to say goodbye to.
Ooh, you heard it here first.
Melanie? That's not on.
Hello. Okay. We are going to do an audience Q&A. There's a microphone in the aisle there, I think. So
There's
if you
one
wanna...
over here, too.
Oh, and there's one over here, too. So just line up behind those, and I'm going to start things out. So both of you taught brilliantly. Thank you very much. About your own writing, and I know both of you are teachers, and the tool that we have for teaching writing that most places use is the workshop. And so I'm wondering if you could share a little bit about your experience being in workshops as students and now as teachers, and how you deal with these same kinds of erasures and prejudices against personal narrative.
Oh, the workshop. I will say that it has changed a lot. When I was a grad student, we used to just come in. I don't even remember my teachers really talking. And they would just let us go for like an hour. I mean, it was just, not what I do in my workshops. The sort of spiel that I give at the beginning of my semesters gets longer and longer and longer. And I basically am moving in the direction of like very little prescription. And like this is something me and Danica talk about all the time because she is in a place where there's like no prescription in her workshop, which I have not arrived there, but I'm moving in that direction. And I have my students lead their own workshop basically, you know, and it was just over the years of observing where and how harm was caused in discussions and the uselessness of, you know, silencing the person whose work is being discussed. Basically, my students present their own work, ask for the kind of feedback that they want, because that's how it is in life, right? Like when we send work to our friends or our writing group, we say, this is where I'm at, this is what I want to hear. For me, it's almost never, tell me everything you think. Please, like project onto me as a screen all of your own ideas about writing, which is not to say it doesn't happen. But workshop is as much an exercise in learning how to ask for feedback and how to discern what kind of help you need with your work as it is sort of a critical reading exercise for everyone else to practice thinking diagnostically, listening and responding sort of as instructed, right? And then there's the whole, you know, you teach nonfiction, there's a lot of feelings that come into the room. And so there's a lot of sort of boundary setting around that. But I am so profoundly gratified by teaching workshop, partly because folks are coming into these classes and doing an interior work that is so, there's just no argument for it not being incredibly valuable. Whatever happens with the work, whether it's published or not, I am so there for the work that my students are doing on the page and inside themselves in my classroom.
Yeah.
What about you?
Ooh, I mean, so I'm teaching in an MFA program for the first time this semester, and I'm so amazed at the quality of their work, and not just like the quality of their work, but the quality of the discussions that we have in class. And so my experience as an MFA student, I graduated in 2019. I feel like even in that sort of 3-year span, the whole culture around workshops has like changed quite a bit, in part because of books like yours and the great Matthew Salasis's book.
And Felicia Rose Chavez.
Yes, I mean, so many, I think that there's a lot of great work questioning the sort of structure of workshop now. I mean, when I teach, you know, I feel like I'm perhaps too present. I think I think my students would probably like it if I were just a little less present in the room. But, you know, I sort of tell them like, you know, you can talk, you can ask questions of your fellow classmates, you can be present and participate in your own workshop. I want that for you because I sort of base it on the way that lab meetings were run when I was in lab, which is that you were expected to present your work and to be an active participant in the discussion of your work, and that's where you learned the most in that dialogue. And the students have been so available to each other. They've been so open to each other's projects, and they've been just like very present in the room. And I feel that when you have an atmosphere like that of people just being present in the room and to the right or at the other end of the table, then the discussions are ultimately just like so much better and richer because you're able to really consider what is it that this work is trying to do. And I'm trying not to be prescriptive. I'm always like, well, you can do that if you want. You should do it. See what happens. Go for it. I love it. Yes. I'm very supportive. I'm very yes and as a as a teacher because I don't know, as an MFA student, you're just figuring it out. You're just trying.
Yep. Looks like we have some, oh, hello, folks. Maybe we can start here and we'll sort of go back and forth. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for the wonderful discussion. I was wondering, Brandon, if you could talk about how you approach writing characters who don't fully understand themselves, particularly Lionel.
Yeah, so, well, I mean, I think that all people are mysteries. I think that not only can I not understand what's going on in another person's head, I don't even understand all the time what's going on in my own head. And I think that when it comes to writing, I'm trying to sort of nudge my characters toward a place of deeper self-understanding. And And sometimes that, like, what that looks like practically is it just means, like, getting the characters into situations, like, letting them be surprised. You know, I feel like if the characters aren't surprised by their own actions, the reader won't be. Like, if a character goes into a scenario and they already know everything, then that's a dead scenario to me as a writer. You know, I'm trying to get my characters into situations that cause them to act and think in ways that they don't see coming, because that's when I can really surprise them. And so I'll get in my head an idea of what the character is like, and I'm always trying to refute that idea. And so I'm always trying to, like, get myself into, trying to paint myself into corners, so to speak, because that's when you're really surprised. When you get a character in a bind that they don't know how to get out of, that's, like, really uncomfortable as a writer. But I think that if you sit in that discomfort and you keep pushing, something really amazing is gonna happen. And so I feel like my process is like this constant exercise in self binding. I'm always sort of like, oh, but what's the thing that I would least like to happen, and then I make it happen. Because then you create opportunities for surprise, and I think opportunities of a surprise are where real moments of revelation happen in a character's life. But yeah, I mean, that's kind of the only way I can write is taking characters further and further from what they know about themselves.
It's legible in the reading experience too, don't you think? Like a story that has been completely mapped out and sort of masterminded beforehand is so much less interesting. And you can't quite name it necessarily when you're reading, but when it is sort of determined at the outset of the process, I think it just, no matter how beautiful or technically astute the writing is, it's just not engrossing in the way that watching a writer move through a character's experience that is surprising to them and to the character.
Yeah, because I mean, like, as a writer, you know what would be upsetting to the scenario you have planned.
Right.
And you do everything you can to avoid it. And
Right.
and what I do is I just do it.
Walk toward it. Yeah.
I, like, upset the apple cart constantly, which makes me very unhappy as a writer, but I'm ultimately happy with the product in the end. So just surprise yourself, I think.
Thank you.
How about over here?
Hi. Hopefully you've been having as good of a time as I've been having. So every written thing is sort of a body unto itself. That's an idea that you explore a lot, Melissa. And then Brandon, we've been talking about the visceral experience of being drawn into a moment and sort of suspended there. And so my question is more of a nuts and bolts craft question. How do you make a sentence, a paragraph, a page feel like it's replicating a bodily experience? Does that come from a place that is nestled inside your own body? Do you think about the structure, the clauses, the length of sentences? How do you approach making the writing feel like a bodily experience?
I would say yes to all of that. Right? I mean, I can speak for myself that when I'm writing in the early stage, it is a very embodied practice. It's not a self-conscious practice. It's why I love it. It's why I keep coming back to it despite the hard parts, is because it is the least self-conscious space I can be in, except maybe like really good sex. Do you know what I mean? Like, I am not thinking about myself at all when I am writing an embodied scene for the first time, right? Like, I am re-inhabiting an experience, as you know, writing nonfiction for me, I'm re-inhabiting a physical experience with more scrutiny, more awareness, I am embodying it more than I could at the time that I experienced it, right? Like, I am going back to my experience without the fear, without the dissociation, from the safe vantage point of my desk, so that I can access the sensory parts of it that I was too shut down for at the time, right? Like, that is the work of nonfiction writing for me, maybe the number one thing that I do it for. And so that part, And it is expressed, I think, in the writing through the rhythm, the phonics, the length of the sentences, the paragraph breaks, the verbiage. All of it is sort of drawing from that bedrock, from that deepest well, right? And then, of course, it's messy, but it's pulsing, like it's there. And I think that's the embodied part. And then the surgeon comes in, and she gets out her little watchmaker tools and starts thinking about clauses and sentences, and did I repeat a word, and maybe I need a shorter sentence in between these longer ones. And then it becomes sort of progressively more and more conscious of self and more conscious of the mechanics of it. And so it's a pretty cold process by the end, but the first one is in full swoon.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I love that. Full swoon. Oh, yes. Also, I think for me, the body is so important to me as both a subject and a mechanism. And the first books I read as a child were romance novels, and I love romance novels.
What romance novel?
Oh, so like, you know, Kathleen Woodiwiss, like Flame in the Flower, The Elusive Flame, A Season Beyond a Kiss. Oh, forget about it. Linda Lyle Miller with her cowboys. I could go on. And so Julianne McLean, I love romance novels. And what's really great about romance novels is that they're so bodily. And romance novels are some of the greatest accounts of what it is to have a deep, rich, emotional experience, love, and also to be so firmly in the body. And so like those were my training wheels, romance novels. And so whenever I'm writing and I'm like over here coldly intellectualizing, making fun of socialists in a story, and then I'll be like, but the body, got to get back to the body, bring it back to the body, find a body somewhere and put it in space, and figuring out like what it's doing. And so for me, the body is it's the thing I know, and it's the thing that I'm always trying to get back to. And what that looks like is like physical details. I get very sort of concrete and very boring, and find my way back to the body. And when I find my way back to the body, that's when I find my way back to rhythm and back to sense and back to sensation. And so the body, I always feel like the body never lets me down. It's the subject that I know, I think, deepest, probably.
It's the most common note I make on my students' work is like, how does this feel in the body?
Oh yeah.
Like, how is this moving
Brain
in the
in
body?
a jar.
Which is, we just went to the Mutter Museum yesterday, so that conjured something very vivid and literal. I forgot what I was going to say, never mind.
Bodies, they're important.
Hi.
Hi there. It's been really wonderful to hear both of you talk about sort of this ongoing conversation about trauma and dealing with it in writing, and a conversation that I sort of see going on and I'm having in a lot of the writing communities I'm moving in is this sort of twofold thing of like the sort of issue of trauma porn, like the danger of sort of mining one's trauma for the sake of an audience that is maybe more invested in the trauma that's involved in the writing than the craft. But then on the flip side, like folks who are feeling like I'm not traumatized enough to write, or which is a problematic thing, and like perhaps another version of that is like I don't feel like my trauma is worthy enough of the attention that the writing has to merit it. And so I'm really curious, like what both of you sort of think about those sort of two sides of that particular conversation.
Well,
I feel like there's a really great part in your book where you say something like your story is worthy, right?
Yeah. I mean, I say that in a lot of different ways in this book, but I mean, I don't know, if you want to write about your trauma in an unprocessed way, like, that's fine. There are people that would be interested in reading that, not me. And I think for me, it's like, I don't know, it's sort of an illusion, like this idea that we're going to exploit our own trauma and write a thrilling, unprocessed story, and people are gonna love it, and we're gonna make money, and it's gonna be wrong. And I'm like, if that works out, congratulations. Like, that's fine. There are plenty of books where I feel like the trauma's not really processed, and it's just kind of a replication of what happened on the page. And I'm not interested in reading that, but I'm not here to speak for other people, and I don't think there's a particular danger in that. You can always stop reading something. There's always that option, you know? You can always stop writing something if it doesn't feel right. But for me, I think it's less about worrying about doing it wrong than thinking about the power of what is possible in that space. And for me, writing is one of the most effective spaces that I have for processing my own trauma. And of course, like, we're using this word trauma, but what I'm just talking about is experience, right? Breakups, weird sexual experiences that were not assaults, but were not pleasurable. Like, what do we call that? We can call it trauma. I'm just processing my experience to glean meaning from it, right? To integrate it into my personhood, into my narrative of my life, and to demonstrate for other people that that's possible. Like, that's it. The stakes are not that high, you know? A lot of us are gonna write for a time just a description of the events that happened, and it's not gonna feel great. You just keep doing it until you get somewhere different, until you get somewhere where your relationship to it has changed, right? Part of the reason I wanted to write this book is because people just get in their own way thinking about doing it wrong. And like, you just do it wrong until you get it right. That's it, right? Until you write a story that you love and that allows you to love yourself a little bit more. Like, that's it, you know? What was the second part?
That's so beautiful.
You know, it's, the stakes are not that high. If you feel like you're re-traumatizing yourself, you stop and you get some support or slow down. But short of that, I'm not worried about trauma porn. I think it's really, really hard to publish a book, and dashing off a timeline of the most traumatic things that ever happened to you is not going to get you published. So I don't think we have to worry about that.
I mean, what I will also say, in addition to all of that, is that we can't let questions of commerce become aesthetic questions of art, you know?
That's right.
And I do think that, yeah, there's this sort of terrifying overculture that's always sort of like looking for what's like quote unquote profitable to it. But I think that we should address those queries to capitalism and that people writing about their trauma because it's what some corporation might want to read. Like, those are conceptions that have to do with commerce, and ultimately our duty and our fealty is to our page and to the story. And I think it's worthy to ask, why do these companies want to snatch up all these books about traumatized brown people all of a sudden? Like, that is an interesting and worthy question to ask, but it is not an artistic question, I think.
Right. And I think, in fact, it's sort of doing the work of centering those forces rather than your own story, to be considering them. And I over the last like 5 to 10 years, the frequency with which in the classroom or in conferences I hear students thinking, okay, but if I write about this, what about that person on Twitter who might be a robot, who might willfully misinterpret my work in the worst possible way? And I just cannot emphasize this more. Like, that person does not belong at the desk with you. Like, we are not writing to the people who are going to willfully misinterpret our stories, right? That is, you know, then this is the radical work of personal narrative, is recentering our own stories and what is meaningful to us in literature, right? And flipping that hierarchy so that we're not bringing in those skeptical voices into our writing process, which is our own holy space.
Totally.
They don't belong there.
Wow.
Thank you both so much.
Hi.
Hi. So both of you spoke so lovely about trauma and writing about like personal experiences, and I wonder if you've ever approached a project or any sort of writing that you've maybe rediscovered part of yourself through that process without intentionally starting out with that.
I don't know that I've ever not done that.
Yeah, it's kind of mission one.
Yeah, it's what Brandon was saying about the surprise, right? Like, if I already understand it, why would I do the work of writing about it just to demonstrate something I already understand? Like, it's actually just not motivation enough. Like, I do this because consistently I unearth things that I did not know before, and parts of myself that I either could not face or I was not acquainted with before. I write as a forum in which to find and meet and greet those parts of myself.
Yeah, there's always something hidden inside of the thing you thought you were looking for.
Oh, yeah.
Like there's always, I mean, I feel like for me, one big moment of that was I set out to write this essay about grief because my mom had died recently, and I was like writing, I was like, I'm gonna write this essay and it's gonna be all about how she was mean to me and how complicated it is to grieve someone you don't like.
Was this the one in that anthology?
Yes, yeah, and so
What my mother and I don't talk about.
yes, and I started writing this essay, and what I discovered was that I actually did really like her. Like, as a person, she was kind of a vibe, and like, you know, I mean, there's so many, and I discovered all these like resonances between us, and I started thinking about like, wow, if she had been born when I was born, she might have had language to talk about some of the parts of her life that she didn't get to express with other people, and how lonely that must have felt for her to sort of, you know, endure, you know, a life being deprived of language for things that she felt and experienced. And writing that essay was really, really hard because it forced me to confront all the ways that I was kind of, I was not a very good son. I kind of sucked. I was an annoying child to raise. And so, yeah, that's one way in which like I went into that essay thinking one thing and was like, wow, I am the loser here. She's like really kind of amazing. So yeah, I mean, the writing constantly surprises me,
yeah.
even in ways that I don't anticipate.
Yeah, I would say my last book, Girlhood, the whole book is just me. It started with an essay of me writing about something that I thought didn't affect me. And I was like, oh, this will be a curious intellectual question. Why did I like spitting on men when I was a dominatrix? And I started plucking at the subject and had to completely rewrite the story. I had the story that I was never bullied as a kid. Like, I was so lucky that I was never bullied. And as it turns out, I was horribly bullied by a neighbor who spat on me every single day at the bus stop. And it was this whole rewriting of my own experience in a way that completely sort of illuminated and clarified so many elements of my adult life and the ways that they were governed by those early experiences. And then I was like, oh, well, what about all these other little chapters where I thought nothing happened? Like, I wonder if something actually happened there. And so I sort of reopened the case and started plucking at them, and lo and behold, you know, I ended up at a cuddle party. So,
Wow.
yeah. I'll just leave it on that cliffhanger.
Extreme girlhood. Yeah. Amazing.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Hi.
Hey, I guess I'll start this by prefacing that I primarily write poetry, and my issue is, how do you approach the complexity of a narrative? Like, what is the first step? Like, what questions do you ask yourself to guide something that is actually cohesive? Because I'll come to the page and think, I want to write this, and then all of a sudden, all of the events unfold, and it's like,
Yeah.
I don't even know what to do.
I mean, there's so much
Yeah.
to say about this. I will just say, sort of to encapsulate it, that when I started off first as a poet, but then as a fiction writer. I started my graduate program in fiction, and you're all so lucky that I switched and stopped writing short stories, because my short stories were like extremely long, extremely dense tracts of interiority and description. And it was basically just like a sad girl packing a suitcase was like the whole story. But it was like 30 pages. I mean, they were just awful.
Okay, but that sounds lit though. Like that's kind of the move.
I mean, I feel like you could pull it off, but I definitely didn't. And I was like submitting these stories to magazines, and I remember, I think it was actually an editor at Tin House was like, after the 20th story I submitted there, was like, hey, so you write really beautiful sentences, but you don't have a fucking clue what a story is? Could you please go figure that out, and then maybe someday we'll publish something of yours? And I was like, oh, what is this narrative of which she speaks? And I had been to a very expensive graduate program. I had gone to an undergraduate program in creative writing. If someone drew, you know, Aristotle's little 3-act structure or Freytag's triangle, I wasn't there that day. So I went to Barnes & Noble, and I looked at all of these books that were like, how to craft a thriller, how to grab them in the first 5 pages. And I basically, then I went and made my way to Poetics and Freytag's triangle, and I figured out what a plot structure was. And I actually very mechanically and very conscientiously sort of taught myself plot structure because I like thrilling page-turning stories, but I'm interested in the interior thoughts of a sad girl packing a suitcase. And I was like, all right, how do I make that not terrifically boring? And it worked. And now I don't have to think about it so much, but I actually drew little 3-act structure graphs for my work for a few years. And the key is basically just to leave almost everything out.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's basically that. I mean, I used to really struggle with plot and structure. I used to also be I write beautiful sentences. I don't know what a story is because I was a scientist. I had no, this whole AWP thing was a mystery to me. Writers, who knows? And I read a lot of plays and read a lot of Chekhov, a lot of Ibsen, and thought really deeply about how those stories worked. And then I started working at a literary magazine and became the person who was in charge of the slush pile. And so was reading hundreds of stories a week and quickly, and not just like reading hundreds of stories, but like reading them with discernment to figure out if they would fit for the magazine. And you learn a lot about structure that way. Like you learn a lot about how stories begin, how they end, et cetera. And my sort of broad organizing principle with respect to narrative is that there are as many different ways to begin a story as there are stories. And you really have to find your own way and means of working. And what I tell my students is get a draft done in any means necessary. And maybe you're a person who has to write 15 pages of images before you go back and find the thread or the through line through it. But every story can have its own organizing logic, its own organizing principles, its own rhythm and structure. Like there isn't one perfect form. Every story is different, and every writer arrives at the structures that mean the most to them in their own way. So it can't be rushed. Yeah. What I say is, like, if you want to write a story, if you want to write a narrative, just put all the stuff down, just draft it. Get it out, and then worry about finding a form that makes sense to you. Because if it makes sense to you, it'll probably make sense to other people. Yeah. But don't try to it can be hazardous to sort of bash your head against a wall for too long.
I would say also just let your favorite works be your teachers. Like it was such a simple thing, and it took me a long time to arrive at what do I love? What do I find absolutely transporting? And to just do imitations of that for a while to sort of internalize those structures and formulas. And then you can sort of subtract the things that don't matter. For me, it's I write long, rambling, experimental, multifarious essays, but I like to read mysteries. So how can I infuse this long researched essay with the through line of a mystery, right? And I have figured out over time how much I can take away from that classic Aristotelian plot structure so that you keep reading even as I'm talking about effing Foucault or whatever.
Yeah. Well, Foucault,
I mean
love Foucault. What a character.
How are we for time, Melanie? One fast one. Who's got a fast one?
It might be a fast one. This one's for Brandon. During your process with writing the character of Lionel, was there ever a point where you thought maybe this guy could be the main character of a novel, or was there something about him that you knew you wanted to tell his story through stories?
Yeah, so no, it was never a novel. I started writing those stories because I had read the linked stories of Mavis Gallant and really loved her sort of suites of stories, and I wanted to try that because I had figured out that I was not a novelist, and I wanted to be a story writer. And so I wrote those stories because I wanted to explore Lionel, but I wanted to revisit him and revisit his story and revisit these other characters through the sort of superstructure of a linked story collection. And I just feel like a story has a different energy than a novel. Like a novel is kind of like you're on the same road for a long, well, good novelists are not, but me as a novelist, I get on a road and I stay on it, and there is no deviating. But with a story, you get to bring in all these different kinds of characters, and the stories, I don't know, they modulate each other, they change each other, and there's something that happens magically in the white space between two stories that are linked. There's all this elision and music, I don't know, it just feels so, it feels constitutionally different from a novel, and so it just felt like a way of capturing some of the breadth of a novel without sort of being wed to its sort of concreteness in a way. Does that make sense? Thank you.
Thank you so much,
Thanks,
everybody.
y'all.